Okay, so without further ado, let me launch into the conversation here. So the question I'm really asking here is, why do state apologize to a social group, especially when they face negative consequences for doing so? And when we look at the prevailing literature, it really suggests that the function of a state apology is to rehumanize the apologizer. That is the state after they've committed a transgression or and have been temporarily, shall we say, otherized in the eyes of the victimized party or the wider community. In effect, by apologizing, the state as a transgressor is attempting to redeem itself while restoring their trustworthiness. And in some rare cases, and so we were looking at so many different cases, but we did find that for the majority, it is really the state trying to rehumanize itself. There are some rare cases, however, where state apologies are employed to rehumanize the apologized by aiming to undo the damage caused by the act of dehumanizing an identifiable social group, whether these groups are refugees, indigenous groups, or ethnic minority groups. In these instances, really, you see that the state apology serves to bring voice and recognition to the grievances suffered by the apologized, even to the extent of, shall we say, perhaps psychologically healing the aggrieved individuals or social groups affected. Now, examples of apologies that at least partially address rehumanizing the apologized includes South Africa's apologies for apartheid and apologies offered to Indigenous groups in Canada. Now, this is not really to imply that such apologies serve no other purpose. In most cases, they did, but they are noteworthy for their focus on the apologized. In contrast, other state apologies, so example is Germany's role in the Holocaust, have primarily been about atonement for the nation state. So similar to acts of ritual purification, the apology serves to cleanse the state and the people it represents, and in the process rehumanize them. Furthermore, in these cases, oh, I'm sorry. Sylvia, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, sorry.
Oh, I apologize. Um, okay, so what I was saying really was, in these cases, the grievances and I guess the trauma of the victimized party often remain insufficiently addressed as to meaningfully benefit them socially and psychologically. So at the end of the day, to best evaluate this sort of discord between state apologies aimed at rehumanizing the apologizer instead of the apologized, what I hope to do in this talk is really to bridge the insights on the literature about apologies, which have focused on how apologies function, and the literature on truth and reconciliation, which is focused on rehumanization. I'm going to engage in these following analytical queries. How are state apologies different towards a social group when the goal is to explicitly rehumanize the apologized, not the apologizer? What happens to the apologizer in such apologies? What can be learned by jointly considering the apology and truth and reconciliation literatures on how to make an effective apology? I will show that while state apologies often rehumanize the apologizer, paradoxically, an apology is only really effective if the intent is to rehumanize the victim, the apologized group. So here I'm going to talk about some of the frameworks and the sort of theoretical constructions, and then try to apply that to the case studies. So the conventional and popular understanding of apologies is relatively straightforward. An individual or a group commits a transgression, breaching the accepted societal norms or even laws of their community. And in doing so, trust is broken between the transgressor and the aggrieved party. Moreover, in some cases, the transgressor's social standing becomes diminished in the eyes of their community, potentially to the point of being ostracized. In an effort to repair this broken trust and potentially restore the reputation for trustworthy behavior, the transgressor really will apologize for their past actions. So one way to really conceptualize this, and this is coming from economics and behavioral economics rather, and management theory, is signaling theory. We can conceptualize the efficacy of apologies through signaling theory. Signaling theory is trying to explain how information between different parties in cases of information asymmetry is communicated or signaled, and how that signal is interpreted. Now, in the context of this conversation, a transgressor's sort of apology signals your fitness to be restored to the in-group. More acutely, what I'm going to suggest here is that apologies signal two things. They are an acknowledgement of shared values and norms which the transgressor sort of violated through their action, and there's an implicit or explicit promise that in the future their behavior will be different. Now, not all apologies are created equal, but what makes an effective apology that properly signals what it is intending to the receiver? And what makes these signals costly to the apologizer? Now, there's some consensus in the literature regarding the bare minimum elements for an apology to be successful. And in this slide, I talk about these four elements. The first is an acknowledgement of a wrong committed, including the harm that is caused. The second is an acceptance of responsibility for having committed the wrong. Third is an expression of regret or remorse, both for the harm and for having committed wrong. And finally, there's a commitment, explicit or implicit, to reparation and, when appropriate, to non-repeat of the wrong. We can frame these sort of guidelines here for best practices through an economic taxonomy of apologies, where the apology's efficacy is measured by the cost associated with it. That is, and this is really key here, the costlier the signal, the more effective it's likely to be. And in other words, the more costlier the apology, the better it's often received by the group that's being apologized to. So there's a few sorts of things we can distinguish when it comes to apologies. There are tangible cost apologies, a commitment to improve conduct, a loss of status, an admission of incompetence, bypassing apologies, and partial apologies. So what I really want to focus on is the tangible cost apologies. And these are the tangible cost apologies are those that include either some sort of material restitution or exposes the transgressor to potential material liability. These apologies can include, for example, monetary reparations to the victims of past transgressions, or in some cases, their family members. Most commonly, reparations occur in state apologies, such as those given to living victims of residential schooling in Canada. Again, this will be a case study I'll be looking at in a few moments. Sometimes monetary reparations can compromise funds spent on community-wide social projects, such as those devoted to educating the public about a past transgression. Effectively, in this sort of apology, the apologizer is promising to do better in the future, and this can serve as an extremely effective signal. Implicitly, the apologizer is accepting that they will be held to a higher standard compared to those who did not apologize. That is, they're promising to do better, and it ups the ante for the apologizer in the future. And if they transgress, again, they can expect to be punished more relative to those who have not apologized. It can be it can be applied, I guess, in a way that it's not just to the apologizer's exact transgression, but to all future transgressions affecting that same group. In other words, sorry, I'm seeing a chat here. Oh, okay. Sorry, it's just sometimes I need to go through screens, so I apologize for that. So really what I'm trying to say here in this framework is that promises to do better can be highly risky for state institutions if they cannot guarantee that transgressions will not reoccur. Now, with this framework in mind, I'm going to turn my attention to a few case studies. I'm going to divide the case studies between apologies that focus on the interests of the apologizer and those that focus on rehumanizing the apologized. So first, I'm going to start off by looking at a partial apology. And here I'm going to look at Germany and the Holocaust. And really, there's no conversation on state apologies that would be complete without mentioning this in some extent. mentioning Germany's apologies for the Holocaust committed during the Second World War. And in particular, I'm going to turn to our attention to West Germany's Chancellor Willy Brandt, who on December 7th, 1970, while visiting Warsaw, fell to his knees in front of the memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, remaining completely still on the wet floor for over half a minute. Now, this apology, known thereafter in Germany as a knifefall, is notable for several reasons. Most significantly, it was the first time a German leader had so explicitly admitted responsibility and guilt for Jewish and Polish suffering. It is this recognition that Germany now shared social norms with their victims, norms that the Nazis had violated, which makes its apology much more about restoring the state's trustworthiness. This apology was a necessary action to restore the state to a position of trust. Perhaps one of the most unique things about Brandt's apology is that it was entirely unspoken. Therefore, it does not compromise the sort of four necessary elements of a complete apology I discussed in the framework, at least explicitly. Nevertheless, it's been recognized as a highly effective apology that helped to restore Germany's relations with its former victims, particularly Poland and wider Eastern Europe. Now, mind you, as I mentioned, I am in Warsaw and I am doing a lot of work on how Poland receives apologies and so forth. And this is still a super contentious issue in the Polish sort of environment. But at the most basic level, we can suggest that it was an effective apology that began at the most basic level to restore Germany's relations with its bordering nations. Now here, there's a signaling taxonomy that's quite informative. While Brandt's apology was silent, it did implicitly contain the costly signal of status loss. Kneeling by its very nature reduces an individual's status in the eyes of those witnessing them. Moreover, the reaction of some German conservatives at home during that period, who questioned his patriotism and whether he should have knelt at all, signaled that Brandt paid a price for his actions. Now, in the paper, I discuss a bit more about this case study, but for brevity, I'm just going to continue on to the other two cases, and then I'm going to provide the lessons learned from these cases, and of course, I'll give you a link to the paper if you want to read more about these experiences here. So I'm going to turn my attention now to the South Africa case, and here we're going to say this is one of the very few examples where the aim was, at least the intent was, to rehumanize the apologized sort of communities. So South Africa really represents the most informative case study on the process of rehumanization, apologizing, reconciliation, and peace building in the wake of severe and prolonged injustice from a policy of apartheid. Now, with the end of apartheid in the early 1990s, one of the most pertinent questions was how to move forward. What was the best way to heal the grievous wounds of the past in a way that allowed for a new democratic, peaceful, and multi-ethnic South Africa? The choice was made to embark on an approach of restorative justice in the form of truth and reconciliation. This process invited victims who were recognized as having underwent gross human rights violations to supply statements about their experiences. The perpetrators of these acts were also given testimony and request amnesty for both criminal and civil prosecution for politically motivated crimes. It was through this process that the architects of the TRC hoped to heal the deep wounds of the past and rehumanize non-white ethnic groups who had suffered under apartheid. Now, the actual successes of the TRC are far much more muddled, with examples of both deep failures and some successes. One of the worst days of the TRC occurred when then President de Klerk apologized to the victims of apartheid on behalf of the National Party. And so in 1997, de Klerk was speaking to the TRC, responding to assertions expressing the country, insisted that he had previously apologized for apartheid. Now, de Klerk's apology was undermined because its mandate to speak on behalf of the National Party was extremely dubious. And it reflects the common difficulty in state apologies. That's to say, intergroup apologies are complicated since groups contain numerous autonomous agents who are capable of acting in distinct ways, even perhaps acting opposing the apology or the group receiving the apology. This can unsurprisingly serve to compromise the apology in the eyes of the recipient group and raise questions about how committed to reconciliation the sort of group truly is. It's worth reminding ourselves, I would suggest, that apologies need to be costly in order to rehumanize the apologizer. And so an apology made with this benefit, with the benefit to the apologizer, effectively lowers the cost of the apology, making the apology less credible and thus less effective. Now, while the function of an apology may be to rehumanize the apologizer, an apologizer that appears to be motivated by restoring the apologizer's status is likely to fail. A good apology has to focus on the victim. Now, that kind of seems normal. It kind of seems commonsensical if I say it in these terms. But when you actually see how apologies get transfused in the everyday globally, generally speaking, as I mentioned, the majority of apologies are restoring trust in those who was the party who created that sort of action in the first place. So state apologies with a focus on rehumanizing the apologized may be more beneficial for the apologizer as well. Now, the third case that I'm going to talk about, and in the paper we look through other cases as well, but just for this talk, I'll look at this last case here. It's Canada and Indigenous residential schools. There's a lot of parallels between Canada's treatment of the Indigenous community and Australia's treatment of the Aboriginal community. So on June 11, 2008, then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to the victims of residential schools. Residential schooling in Canada has had a long and tragic history, beginning as far back as the early 1600s with the opening of the first boarding schools. However, it really wasn't until the Indian Act of 1877, which made Indigenous peoples wards of the state, and the Canadian federal government responsible for their education, that the system truly took a sort of a negative effect. From 1867 to 1983, nearly 1/3 of all Indigenous children, approximately 150,000 in total, were taken from their families and communities and sent to these schools, which was funded by the state and presided over by churches. Now, the impact of this system, akin to Australia, continues to reverberate throughout the Indigenous communities, with prevalent research suggesting that there's a higher rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, domestic violence, mental illness, and suicide among Indigenous people in Canada. Now, in 2006, the government approved the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which included a payment, which included a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a health and healing services, and a commemoration. The federal government in Canada provided about 1.9 billion Canadian dollars, which is probably similar in Australian terms at this stage, to former living members of recognized residential schools, and it was intended to holistically address the experiences of attending residential schooling. Now, what I want to focus really is on the apology that was given. The actual apology offered in the Canadian Parliament is perhaps one of the best textbook apologies I've seen in the literature or in many of the cases. So the tone and substance of the apology was directly informed by letters from Indigenous groups, such as the Assembly of First Nations, and through meetings with survivors of residential schools. This can be understood as an important process in giving voice to the grievances of those who suffered by directly allowing them to have an influence in the tenor of the apology. Further, the government found a sort of a loophole that allowed Indigenous leaders to directly respond to the apology in the Canadian Parliament, instead of at a press conference as the government originally planned. So the apology was effusive, praising the strength of the Indigenous communities and apologizing profoundly for the government's role in the residential school system, as well as the damage it caused and continues to cause to Indigenous communities. Moreover, the Prime Minister directly referenced how the TRC was an opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential school systems. The apology contained all the four of the elements as being necessary for a complete apology. Further, the apology contained costly signals. The tangible cost is evident as the apology followed on the backdrop of the substantive funding. Further, while not expressly promising to not repeat the act, the Prime Minister implicitly did so through his comments. It can also be inferred that the Prime Minister experienced some status loss through apologizing. For example, he actually praised his political rival and his ideological opposite for having spent the last year or two persuading the Prime Minister to apologize. Praising a rival leader in this manner caught many in the Canadian media by shock. This apology, while undeniably undertaking, is part of a. Sorry, well, let me put it another way. This apology was a way to restore trust between the government and Indigenous communities, and also emphasize the rehumanization, or at least starting that sort of process of rehumanizing Indigenous communities. So, what are the lessons learned? What are the key takeaways from this really brief presentation? Well, state apologies are typically about signaling trustworthiness. They're about restoring the apologizer, in this example, the state, to full standing within their community. I've argued that a restoration of trustworthiness is demonstrated by an agreement that what happened was a violation, an acknowledgement of shared values, and that the future will be better, and with that, a willingness to be held to a higher standard. Every state apology discussed today contained these elements to some extent. Now, the failure of apologies can be attributed to the reluctance of the apologizing parties to pay a real cost for their past actions, and an insufficient focus on the rehumanization of the victimized party. When considering state apologies that are effective, the more effective state apologies are those that are costly to fake. But differently, if the apologizer is sacrificing something to the apologized is more likely to believe the apologizer is being genuine. So we can delineate that an effective rehumanizing apology should, one, clearly identify the violation, two, promise with clear language ways to make amends for the transgression, that it won't happen again, and an agreement to be held to a higher standard. Three, identify the reason for the failure and admit that it was a failure. And four, avoid partial apologies that do not take responsibility for what has occurred. A state apology that does not have a guarantee appears to lack sincerity, since the apologizer is leaving open the possibility that they will commit future transgressions. There's also an inherent paradox to state apologies. While they only work if they are costly, an effective state apology that restores the transgressor to good standing effectively lowers the cost, making it easier to apologize. But another way, if the apologizer is more trusted by the apologized, the necessary costliness for a signal to be effective is lowered. So the lesson here is that the focus should be on rehumanizing the apologized social group, not the apologizer. Any state apology too focused on the apologizer is seen as self-serving and therefore less costly and less believable. The state apology focused on rehumanizing the apologized is therefore paradoxically more effective at rehumanizing the apologizer as well. So that's a sort of brief sort of spiel I have on how states can effectively apologize and, as the title suggests, have a long-lasting positive effect on the aggrieved party.